In the heart of a dense, whispering forest, where towering pines stretched toward the sky and the air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, a young girl named Lily made a discovery that would change her life forever. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those golden-lit days where sunlight filtered through the leaves in dappled patterns. She had wandered just beyond the familiar path near her family's cabin, her small boots crunching against twigs and leaves, when she heard it, a faint, desperate whimper. Curious and concerned, Lily followed the sound until she reached a small clearing. There, nestled in a hollowed-out tree trunk, were 5 tiny bear cubs. Their fur was soft and patchy, their eyes wide with fear and hunger. They huddled together, trembling, their mother nowhere in sight. Lily's heart clenched. She knew enough about the forest to understand that a mother bear would never willingly leave her young. Something had happened. These cubs were alone, vulnerable, and unlikely to survive without help. She felt a pang of fear. What if the mother returned, angry and defensive? But as she looked into the frightened eyes of the cubs, sympathy and determination outweighed her fear. She couldn't just walk away. The challenge was immense. Lily was just a child herself, and these were wild animals. How could she help them? Would they even trust her? Swallowing her hesitation, she carefully removed her scarf and, moving slowly so as not to frighten them, reached out a gentle hand. What she didn't know then was that this single act of kindness would one day be repaid in the most astonishing way. The cubs were so small, their tiny bodies barely covered in fur, their eyes filled with confusion and fear. Lily knelt beside the hollow tree, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been this close to wild animals before, let alone one so helpless. Her father had always warned her that the forest was full of untamed creatures, some gentle, some dangerous. But looking at these 5 trembling cubs, all she saw was innocence. She glanced around, searching for any sign of their mother. Perhaps she had gone to find food. Maybe she had been frightened away. But deep down, a nagging feeling told her the truth. Something had happened. A mother bear would never leave her young unless she had no choice. Lily bit her lip, weighing her options. If she left them there, they would starve. If she tried to take them home, what if they rejected her help? Would they even survive without their mother? A soft whimper brought her attention back to the smallest cub, barely able to lift its head. Instinct took over. Carefully, she removed her wool scarf and reached out, her movements slow and deliberate. The cubs flinched, pressing themselves into the bark of the tree, their tiny claws digging into the rough wood. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice gentle. "I won't hurt you." One of the larger cubs let out a tiny growl, a brave attempt at defense. But its frail body betrayed its weakness. They were hungry, scared, and alone. Determined, Lily took a deep breath. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out the crust of bread she had saved from lunch. She broke off a small piece and placed it on the ground. The cubs hesitated, their noses twitching at the scent. After a few moments, the bravest one, a dark-furred cub with a white patch on its chest, crawled forward. It sniffed the bread, then took a cautious bite. Lily smiled. Encouraged, she slowly moved closer, offering another piece. One by one, the cubs inched forward, their fear giving way to hunger. When the smallest cub finally took a bite, Lily knew she couldn't leave them behind. She took off her coat and, one by one, carefully lifted the cubs into its folds, bundling them together to keep them warm. They whimpered at first, but didn't resist. She could feel their tiny bodies shivering against her as she held them close. The journey back to her family's cabin was slow and careful. The cubs were light, but their weight grew heavier with each step. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Lily's arms ached, but she pressed on, her determination unwavering. By the time she reached the cabin, her father stood on the porch, his arms crossed, his expression shifting from confusion to shock as he took in the sight of his daughter cradling 5 bear cubs in her coat. "Lily," he started, stepping down the porch stairs. "What have you done?" "They were alone," she said, her voice small but firm. "I couldn't leave them." Her father knelt beside her, inspecting the cubs with a mixture of concern and admiration. He ran a hand through his graying beard, exhaling slowly. Their mother? I didn't see her, Lily admitted, her throat tightening. I think something happened to her. Her father sighed. This is a big responsibility. Lily nodded. I know. For a long moment, he was silent. Then, he reached out, gently touching the head of the smallest cub. It let out a tiny sound, barely more than a squeak, and nestled closer into Lily's coat. Finally, her father stood. We'll take care of them, he said. But they're wild animals, Lily. One day, we'll have to let them go. Lily looked down at the 5 fragile creatures in her arms, already feeling a connection stronger than words could describe. She nodded, though a part of her wished that day would never come. She had saved them, and in that moment, she had no way of knowing that, years later, they would return the favor in the most unbelievable way. The 5 bear cubs had never known warmth like this before. They had huddled together for survival in the cold forest, but now they were wrapped in blankets by the crackling fireplace, their tiny noses twitching at unfamiliar scents. The wooden walls of the cabin were sturdy and safe, a stark contrast to the damp hollow where they had been found. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, watching them closely. They were still wary, their little bodies tense. She understood their fear. Everything was new, and she was a stranger. She had done her best to make them comfortable, offering them warm milk and bits of softened bread, but they remained hesitant, pressing against one another for reassurance. Then came Max. The family's golden retriever had been watching from a distance, his head tilted in curiosity. He had seen many things in his years, a lost fawn once, a family of raccoons sneaking around the woodpile, but never bear cubs. His tail wagged slowly, his brown eyes filled with gentle interest. Lily noticed his approach and held up a hand. Easy, Max, she murmured. They're scared. Max, ever the gentle soul, lowered himself to the floor, creeping forward on his belly. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he understood that these tiny creatures needed patience. He stopped just a few feet away, his big nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The cubs, still wary, watched him with wide eyes. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the smallest cub, the one Lily had been most worried about, let out a soft, curious grunt. It shuffled forward just a little, its wobbly legs unsure. Max stayed perfectly still, his tail thumping lightly against the wooden floor. Lily held her breath. The cub sniffed Max's outstretched paw, then hesitated. Slowly, cautiously, it nudged against the dog's thick fur. Max responded by giving the gentlest wag of his tail. The other cubs, emboldened by their siblings' bravery, inched forward one by one. Sniff. Nudge. A tiny paw pressed against Max's side, testing his warmth. When he didn't react, other than a soft, reassuring sigh, they grew bolder. One climbed clumsily onto his front leg, another nosed at his ear. Max licked his lips, watching them with patient amusement. Lily couldn't believe what she was seeing. Over the next few days, the transformation was astonishing. The cubs, once timid and unsure, began to follow Max wherever he went. When he lay by the fire, they curled up beside him, their tiny bodies pressing into his golden fur. When he padded around the cabin, they stumbled after him, still unsteady but determined to keep up. And Max? He had become their protector. If they squeaked in distress, he was there in an instant, nudging them gently with his nose. If they wandered too far, he herded them back with soft nudges. Lily had never seen anything like it. One afternoon, as the autumn sun bathed the cabin in warm light, Lily sat on the porch steps, watching Max play with his new companions. The biggest cub had figured out how to pounce, launching itself onto Max's tail with a playful growl. Another cub joined in, swiping clumsily with its tiny paw. Max let out a dramatic sigh, rolling onto his back in mock defeat. The cubs, triumphant, clambered all over him, their high-pitched grunts filling the air. Lily laughed. You've got your paws full, don't you, boy? Max's tail thumped against the wooden planks, his eyes twinkling with amusement. It was a sight she would never forget. A golden retriever and 5 bear cubs, an unlikely but perfect family. Each day, the bond between them grew stronger. The cubs learned from Max how to play, how to trust, how to feel safe. And in return, Max had found something he hadn't even known he was missing, a purpose beyond being just a family pet. He was their protector, their teacher, their friend. But Lily knew, deep down, that this couldn't last forever. The cubs were growing fast. Soon, they would have to return to the wild where they belonged. For now, though, she let herself enjoy this strange, beautiful moment. She didn't know what the future would bring, but one thing was certain. This bond, this love, would never be forgotten. And neither would the cubs. Not even years later, when they would return in a way no one could have ever expected. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Max and the bear cubs deepened in ways Lily could have never imagined. What had started as cautious curiosity had grown into something much more, a friendship that defied nature itself. The cubs no longer clung to each other out of fear. They clung to Max. They followed him everywhere, their stubby legs scrambling to keep up as he trotted around the yard. If Max stopped to sniff at something, 5 tiny noses joined him, investigating whatever had caught his attention. When he flopped down onto the porch for an afternoon nap, they piled on top of him like a heap of furry shadows, their small chests rising and falling in sync with his steady breaths. Lily watched in amazement as the cubs not only accepted Max as their protector, but started mimicking his behavior. They learned to wag their stubby tails when excited, to perk their ears at the sound of Lily's voice. The smallest cub, the one that had been weakest when she first found them, had grown particularly attached to Max. He was the first to snuggle against the retriever on chilly nights, the first to nuzzle into his golden fur when seeking comfort. One day, as autumn began painting the leaves in warm hues of orange and gold, Lily stood at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin, watching Max lead the cubs on what could only be described as a dog lesson. Max had discovered a stick, his favorite toy, and he pranced around with it, tail wagging as he showed off. The cubs watched him closely, tilting their heads in confusion. Then, after a moment, the bravest among them decided to play along. He clumsily snatched up a fallen branch and attempted to mimic Max's enthusiastic display, though his coordination left much to be desired. The other cubs soon followed, each grabbing a twig or a leaf, prancing around in an awkward, wobbly imitation of their golden teacher. Lily laughed, unable to contain her delight. Max, ever patient, seemed pleased with his pupils. He nudged the smallest cub encouragingly, as if to say, "You're getting it." The little one responded by dropping his stick at Max's feet, an offering of trust and admiration. But their bond wasn't just about play. It was about comfort, about protection, about love. One evening, as the air turned crisp and the sky faded into a deep blue, a distant rumble of thunder echoed through the forest. The cubs, startled, instinctively huddled together. Their small bodies trembled with uncertainty. They had never heard such a sound before. Max, sensing their fear, rose to his feet and padded over to them. Without hesitation, he lay down in the center of their huddle, pressing his warm body against theirs. One by one, the cubs burrowed into his fur, their fear melting away in his steady presence. Lily watched from the doorway, her heart swelling. They had come so far from that frightened pile of fur she had found in the woods. They were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. Max had become their guardian in every way. If a bird swooped too close, he would bark, standing between the cubs and any perceived threat. If one of them tumbled while playing, he would be there in an instant, nudging them back onto their feet. And in return, the cubs treated Max as one of their own. They nuzzled him, shared their food with him, even when he clearly had no interest in raw berries, and followed his lead in all things. But the most touching moment came one chilly morning, when Lily awoke to find Max missing from his usual spot by the fireplace. She frowned, stepping outside onto the porch, and then she saw them. There, nestled in a warm pile beneath the old oak tree, was Max, completely covered by the cubs, their little bodies draped over him like a protective blanket. It was as if, after all the warmth and comfort he had given them, They were now returning the favor. Lily smiled, her heart full. The cubs were growing. Soon, too soon, they would have to return to the wild. But no matter where they went, no matter how big they got, one thing was certain. They would always remember Max. And somehow, Lily had a feeling that one day, when it mattered most, they would prove it. As the months passed, the cubs grew stronger, their once wobbly legs now sturdy, their once timid eyes filled with curiosity and confidence. But with growth came new challenges. The first real obstacle arose when the cubs' instincts began to surface. They were, after all, wild animals, and no matter how deeply they bonded with Max, their nature couldn't be ignored. One crisp morning, Lily found them digging up the vegetable garden, their strong paws effortlessly tearing through the soil. Max barked in protest, bounding over to stop them, but the cubs merely grunted in amusement, treating it as a game. Lily sighed as she watched Max desperately try to herd them away, only for them to scatter playfully, oblivious to his frustration. He had been their teacher in many ways, but this was a reminder that they weren't domesticated dogs. Despite their mischievous streak, the cubs also faced struggles of their own. One night, a powerful storm rolled through the valley, the wind howling through the trees like a restless spirit. Rain battered the roof of the cabin, and thunder cracked across the sky. Max, unbothered by the storm, lay curled up by the fire. But the cubs, now too big to pile onto his back, trembled in the corner, their bodies pressed together in fear. Max lifted his head, ears twitching at their soft whimpers. He stood, stretched, and padded over to them. With a gentle nudge, he coaxed the smallest cub away from the pile. The little one hesitated, but Max licked his forehead reassuringly before lying down beside him. One by one, the other cubs followed, curling against him for warmth and comfort. By morning, the storm had passed, and the cubs, once terrified, now stretched lazily in the early sunlight, their fear forgotten. But the biggest challenge came in late winter. One afternoon, as Lily and her father were out gathering firewood, Max and the cubs wandered near the tree line. The forest was familiar, but it was still wild, and danger could always lurk in the shadows. That day it did. A lone wolf had caught their scent. It was thin and hungry, its ribs visible beneath its gray fur. Desperation had driven it too close to the cabin, too close to unfamiliar creatures that smelled neither entirely wild nor entirely tame. Max was the first to sense it. His body tensed, his fur bristling. He stepped forward, placing himself between the cubs and the intruder. The wolf hesitated, sizing him up. The cubs, sensing the tension, huddled together, their playful innocence replaced by instinctual fear. Lily, hearing the distant growl, turned just in time to see Max standing firm, his body low, his lips curled in warning. The wolf took a step closer, and then something unexpected happened. The biggest cub, once the most mischievous, let out a deep, rumbling growl. It wasn't the squeaky protest of a playful bear cub. It was a real growl, low and commanding. The other cubs followed, standing beside Max, their young bodies radiating a strength Lily had never seen before. The wolf hesitated. 5 growing bears and 1 determined dog. It wasn't worth the risk. With a final glance, it slunk back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. Max huffed, his tail flicking. The cubs, still alert, slowly relaxed. The danger had passed. Lily ran to them, her heart pounding. She knelt beside Max, rubbing his fur. "Good boy," she whispered. Then she looked at the cubs who had stood their ground, who had, in their own way, protected Max just as he had always protected them. The bond between them had been tested, but it had only grown stronger. Lily knew the time was coming, the day when the cubs would have to return to the wild. But as she looked at them now, standing beside Max like equals, she realized something. They weren't just learning from Max. They were becoming something more. And one day, when it mattered most, they would prove it. Winter had finally loosened its grip on the valley, and the forest was waking up. Snowdrifts melted into rushing streams. The trees shook off their icy coats, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and new life. But for Lily, this change brought something she had been dreading. the time to say goodbye. The cubs had grown strong, their bodies no longer small and fragile, but sturdy and powerful. Their once clumsy steps were now confident strides. And though they still curled up beside Max on cold nights and played in the clearing, Lily could see it in their eyes. The forest was calling them home. Her father had been right from the start. One day, they would have to let them go. The decision was made on a quiet morning. The cubs had started wandering farther from the cabin, disappearing into the trees for longer periods. When they returned, they smelled of pine and damp leaves, their coats dusted with dirt from the dens they had begun digging. They were preparing for life in the wild, even if they didn't realize it. So, with a heavy heart, Lily and her father led them to the edge of the woods, just beyond the clearing where she had first found them. Max padded alongside them, his ears low, sensing the change. The cubs followed, unaware of what this moment meant. Lily knelt and stroked the smallest cub's thick fur. "You're ready now," she whispered. The cubs sniffed the air, hesitant. The forest was familiar but different now. It was home, but it was also unknown. Then, as if deciding all at once, they moved. First one, then another, then all five together, stepping into the trees, disappearing into the wilderness that had been their birthplace. Max let out a soft whimper, but stayed where he was. He understood, even if it hurt. Lily wiped her eyes. "They'll be okay," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. The forest swallowed them up, leaving only silence behind. For days, the absence was unbearable. Max wanted the cabin, sniffing at their old sleeping spots, his tail drooping. Lily kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see them tumbling back into the yard. But they didn't return, until the day everything changed. It happened in the late afternoon when Lily was fetching water from the stream. She had just bent down when a rustling in the underbrush made her freeze. A shadow moved between the trees. Then another, and another. Her breath caught. The cubs, no, not cubs anymore, but young bears, stood at the tree line. Their bodies had grown larger, their fur thicker, their eyes wiser. But it wasn't just them. Lily turned as Max bounded forward, his tail wagging wildly, a bark of joy escaping his throat. The largest bear huffed softly, stepping toward him. And then, to Lily's astonishment, he nudged Max's head, just as Max had done to comfort him all those months ago. They hadn't just left. They had come back. And in that moment, Lily knew the bond they had built would never be broken. Lily watched, her heart swelling with something between joy and disbelief, as the young bears stood at the tree line, no longer cubs but strong, wild creatures in their own right. Yet despite the time and distance, they had returned, not because they needed help, but because they remembered. Max wagged his tail furiously, circling them with excited barks, nuzzling each one as if to check that they were real. The largest bear, once the mischievous leader, huffed and playfully nudged Max in return, a silent acknowledgement of their bond. Lily stepped forward cautiously, unsure if they would recognize her after all these months. But the smallest bear, the one who had always been the most timid, moved first. With slow, careful steps, he approached her and pressed his massive head gently against her shoulder. Tears pricked at Lily's eyes as she placed a hand on his thick fur. "You didn't forget," she whispered. The bears lingered for a while, their presence filling the clearing with something almost magical. They weren't the same helpless cubs she had once cradled in her arms. They were wild, free, exactly as they were meant to be. But the love that had grown between them, the trust, the bond, hadn't faded. It had only deepened. After a while, the bears turned back toward the trees, disappearing into the wilderness once more. But Lily wasn't sad this time. She knew now that this wasn't goodbye. Max sat beside her, his tail still wagging, his gaze fixed on the forest. She ruffled his fur and smiled. "They'll always be part of us," she said softly. And in her heart, she knew it was true. Because love, whether between humans, dogs, or even wild bears, was something that could never be forgotten. It would always find its way back home.